It was a quiet Saturday morning when he drove down the familiar winding road that led to his lake cabin. The sun was rising over the water, painting the sky in streaks of gold and orange. He felt that familiar peace that only this place could bring him. For years, the cabin had been his retreat, a place where he could get away from the noise of work, the constant buzz of phones in the crowded city. Here there was only the sound of birds, the soft lapping of water against the dock, and the smell of pine trees in the cool air. He parked his truck near the cabin, grabbed a bag of groceries from the back seat. He was planning a lazy weekend fishing in the morning, reading on the porch in the afternoon, maybe taking the old canoe out if the weather stayed calm. He walked up the small path, whistling to himself. But the moment he reached the front door, the whistling stopped. His eyes landed on a piece of paper that had been taped right across the middle of the door. At first, he thought it might just be a flyer, maybe some local handyman advertising his services. But the paper was too official looking, with bold black letters at the top and a red stamp in the corner. He put down the grocery bag and peeled it off the door. The words hit him like a slap. Notice of violation. You are occupying property that is subject to the Lakeview Homeowners Association rules and regulations. Continued unauthorized use may result in fines, penalties, and eviction proceedings. For a second, he just stood there, blinking at the page, almost laughing because it felt like a bad joke. Eviction? Fines? What on earth were they talking about? He had bought this cabin years ago, fair and square. He had a deed, paperwork, and a file in his home office drawer with every tax receipt he had ever paid. This land was his, no question about it. He read the notice again, slower this time, noticing the signature at the bottom. It was signed by someone calling themselves president of the Lakeview HOA. Now he was even more confused. An HOA. Didn't even know there was a homeowners association around this lake. The cabin was in an older part of the county, surrounded by scattered properties and woods. Sure, on the other side of the lake there were newer houses, big fancy homes with trimmed lawns and private driveways, but he had never thought of them. As part of any official group that could claim authority over his place, he unlocked the cabin and went inside, dropping the groceries on the kitchen counter, but the peace he had felt driving here was gone. His mind was racing. He couldn't shake the words eviction proceedings. The cabin wasn't just a weekend getaway, it was a piece of his life. His father had fished with him here, friends had visited, and some of his best memories had been made on that porch. The idea that some group of strangers thought they could take it away from him made his stomach churn. After pacing the small living room for a while, he went back outside to see if any neighbors were around. Across the dirt road, an older man, named Joe, was standing by his truck, loading some fishing gear. They had known each other for years, always exchanging a wave or a quick chat. He walked over, holding the notice in his hand. "Hey Joe, you know anything about this?" he asked, holding up the paper. Joe squinted at it, then shook his head slowly. "Yeah, I've heard about them. The HOA from across the lake. They've been trying to get their hands on more property around here. Claim they run everything near the water. But this is my cabin," he said firmly. "I bought it. I pay taxes every year. How can they say I'm breaking rules I never agreed to?" Joe sighed. "They've been bullying people. A couple folks down the road got similar notices. Most of us just ignore them, but they're persistent. They like to scare people with big words and threats. Some people even paid fines just to make them go away." That last part made his blood boil. He wasn't about to be bullied, and he definitely wasn't paying some fake fine. Still, the thought of an eviction proceeding lingered in his head. Could they actually pull something like that off? He thanked Joe and walked back to his cabin, sitting on the porch steps. The lake was calm, the water glistening under the sun, but his mind felt stormy. He read the notice again and noticed another line he had missed before. Failure to comply may result in legal action, including but not limited to removal of unauthorized structures and denial of access to community property. Unauthorized structures. Denial of access. Were they seriously calling his cabin unauthorized? And what community property were they talking about? His dock? The little strip of grass leading to the water? He couldn't believe it. He spent the rest of the afternoon trying to shake it off, telling himself it was nothing but an empty threat. He grilled some hot dogs, took his canoe out for an hour, even tried to read a book on the porch. But every time the wind rustled, he imagined another notice being slapped onto his door. The next morning, his fears deepened when he checked his mailbox back in town. Among the usual bills and junk mail was an envelope with the same HOA letterhead. Inside was a formal letter demanding payment of back dues for the last 3 years. The total was several $1,000s. He nearly dropped the letter. Not only were they threatening eviction, now they were demanding money. For services he had never used, for an organization he had never joined. It felt like some kind of scam. Except it had all the trappings of something official legal wording, threats of liens, even a deadline for payment. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. He wasn't the type of man to get scared off easily. He worked hard, paid his bills, and minded his own business. For some group of self-important strangers to claim they had the power to take his land infuriated him. But beneath the anger was a knot of worry. He had seen enough stories about people losing property in messy legal battles to know that sometimes the truth didn't matter if someone was determined enough to push. That night he barely slept. He lay awake, listening to the hum of his ceiling fan, replaying the notice in his head. Eviction fines. Back dues. Every word felt heavier in the darkness. By morning, he made a decision. He wasn't going to ignore this. He was going to face it head-on and prove once and for all that this cabin was his, no matter what the so-called HOA claimed. And so, what had started as a peaceful weekend at the lake had turned into the beginning of a battle he never expected to fight. He arrived at the meeting hall on a Thursday evening, clutching the notice and the letter about back dues. The building was one of those small community centers near the newer houses on the other side of the lake. The parking lot was already half full when he pulled in, and he could see groups of people standing outside, talking in low voices before the meeting began. He felt out of place walking in, like an outsider stepping into a private club where everyone already knew each other. Inside, rows of metal chairs had been set up, facing a long table at the front. Behind the table sat a group of people who looked far too comfortable in their positions. There was a woman in a stiff blazer flipping through a stack of papers. A man with a shiny watch tapping his pen against the table and at the center. A heavy-set man with slicked-back hair and a smirk that never seemed to leave his face. That man, he quickly realized, was the president. The room was buzzing with chatter until the president cleared his throat and called the meeting to order. People quieted down as he began talking about dues, landscaping, and community improvements. It all sounded like routine business until the president's tone shifted. He leaned forward, his voice sharp. As he announced that there was a case of someone illegally occupying association property, everyone turned their heads, and he suddenly felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. The president's smirk widened. "Yes, we're talking about the man sitting right there," he said, pointing directly at him. Heat rose in his chest. Stood up, holding his deed in his hand. "I think you're mistaken," he said firmly. "This is my cabin. I bought it years ago. I've got the deed right here." The president waved a dismissive hand. "Our records show that property is under the jurisdiction of Lakeview HOA. If you're there, you're bound by our rules. Doesn't matter what papers you wave around." Murmurs spread through the room. Some people looked curious, others smug, as if they enjoyed the spectacle. He unfolded the deed and read aloud the legal description, making sure his voice was clear. "This is county recorded. This is my property." "I don't answer to your rules," the woman in the blazer snorted. "People bring fake documents all the time. You'll need more than that to convince us." His fists tightened at his sides. "Fake. This is from the county courthouse. You can look it up yourself." But they didn't want to listen. The man with the shiny watch leaned forward and sneered. "You're squatting on land that belongs to this association. We've been more than patient, but your time is up." "Squatting?" he repeated, almost laughing at the absurdity. "I've been paying taxes on that land for years. Kept up the cabin myself. You've never done a single thing for my property." The president leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. That's not how this works. Our rules are clear. If you want to stay, you pay back dues. If not, you'll be removed. Simple as that. His blood boiled at the smug tone. He held the deed higher. I don't owe you a dime. You have no authority over my cabin or my dock. The president's smirk vanished for a moment, replaced by a flash of anger. Careful, he said, his voice low but sharp. You can have your boat towed by the weekend. You can block the road leading to your property. You'll regret making this harder than it needs to be. The threats hung in the air, heavy and ugly. People whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others nodding as if they supported the board. He looked around the room, feeling like he was standing in a nest of snakes. He shoved the deed back into his folder and glared at the table. You try towing my boat and I'll have the sheriff down here before you even start the engine? You think you can scare me, but you don't know who you're dealing with? The president slammed his hand on the table, startling the crowd. Enough. You've wasted enough of this association's time. Either you pay, or you'll find yourself without access to your so-called property very soon. He didn't bother to respond. His anger was too hot, his hands trembling as he turned and stormed out of the room. He could still hear the murmurs. Behind him, voices rising and falling, some laughing, some whispering, but he didn't care. He pushed through the doors into the cool night air, his chest tight and his mind racing. Outside, he leaned against his truck, breathing hard. He had expected some kind of misunderstanding, maybe a quick explanation, maybe even an apology once he showed the deed. But what he had walked into was something else entirely. These people weren't just mistaken, they were arrogant, hostile. And determined to take what wasn't theirs, he climbed into his truck and sat there for a while, staring out the windshield. He felt both furious and helpless, like he had walked into a fight he hadn't been prepared for. But one thing was certain. They weren't going to push him around. On the drive back to his cabin, the president's words echoed in his head. Towing. The boat. Blocking access. Squatter. The arrogance in their voices fueled his anger even more. If they thought they could bully him into paying, they had chosen the wrong man. When he got back to the cabin, he dropped the folder with the deed on the table and sat down hard in the old wooden chair. His hands were still shaking, but underneath the anger was a new sense of determination. If they wanted a fight, then a fight was what they were going to get. He wasn't going to let anyone, especially a group of smug board members, steal what he had worked for. That night, as the crickets chirped outside and the moonlight shone across the lake, he stayed awake thinking about what had just happened. The image of the president's smirk burned in his mind, and the threats replayed over and over. He realized then that this wasn't going to be as simple as waving his deed in their faces. They weren't going to back down. They were going to push and keep pushing until they got what they wanted, and that meant he had to push back. Harder, he decided that very moment he would gather every piece of paperwork he had. He would go through his records, call the courthouse if he had to, and make sure his ownership was airtight. If they wanted a battle, then he would arm himself with the strongest weapon he had, the truth written in black and white on legal documents. He shut off the lamp. Lying back in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, he wasn't scared anymore. Was angry, yes, but more than that, he was ready. They thought they could threaten him. They thought they could bluff him into submission. Soon enough, they were going to find out just how wrong they were. 2,000 words me, simple or interesting English me. Surfwa hijo, outline K part 3, mi tha, usko kahani, ki for mi lekunga, not headings, not extra cheese, bus flow me story. The next morning he woke up earlier than usual, the anger from the meeting still burning inside him. The president's smug face and the word squatter echoed in his head over and over again. He knew talking to those people again was useless, as they weren't going to listen, not when they had already made up their minds, if he wanted to. Shut them down once and for all, he needed proof. More than just waving his deed around in front of them, he pulled out the old wooden box he kept under the bed at his townhouse. Inside were files, receipts, and paperwork from when he bought the cabin years ago. He laid everything out on the dining table, flipping through each paper carefully. There was the purchase agreement, signed and notarized. There were the tax bills he had paid every single year without fail. There were letters from the county confirming property lines, but he wanted more. He wanted something so solid that even the smug president of the HOA couldn't twist it around. So he called his lawyer. The lawyer, a sharp man named Daniels, listened carefully as he explained the situation. At first, Daniels chuckled. "They're probably bluffing," he said. "HOAs love to puff out their chests. If you're not a member, they can't just claim you are." "I don't want probably," he said firmly. "I want to be certain. I want every stone turned over, every record checked." Daniels agreed to meet him at the county courthouse that afternoon. Together, they walked into the records office, where dusty books and computer terminals lined the walls. An older clerk greeted them, and Daniels explained what they were looking for. For hours, they dug through old records. The clerk pulled out maps, surveys, and deeds that stretched back decades. Every line, every detail mattered. Flipping through a large bound record book, Daniels stopped and tapped his finger on a page. "Here," he said. The protagonist leaned closer. His eyes scanned the document, and his heart began to pound. The deed he had wasn't just for the small cabin and the patch of grass around it. It covered the entire lakeside lot, the dock, the stretch of shoreline, even the area the HOA claimed. Was there community space? He blinked, reading it again just to be sure. This says I own the dock too?" Daniels nodded slowly. "That's what it says. Not just the dock, the whole lot." Washed over him. All this time, the HOA had been threatening him, acting like he was trespassing on their property, when in reality, they were the ones trespassing on his. But that wasn't even the biggest surprise. As they dug deeper, Daniels pulled another file, one connected to the previous owner of the property. It listed assets left behind when the property was transferred. One of those items was a small motorboat that had been abandoned and rolled into the property sale. The same boat the HOA president had been using and bragging about as the community boat. He stared at the file, hardly believing what he was seeing. That boat, the one he had watched the president ride across the lake countless times, wasn't the association's at all. It was his. It had been his ever since the day he bought the cabin. Daniels looked at him with a small smile. "They don't have a leg to stand on. If they try to push this, we'll crush them in court." For the first time in days, he felt like the ground under his feet was steady again. The anger was still there, but now it had fuel. He wasn't just defending his rights anymore. He had the power to turn the tables. They made copies of every record, every survey, every map. Daniels helped organize everything into a thick folder that would hold up in any courtroom. On the drive home, he kept glancing at the passenger seat where the folder rested. It felt heavier than paper. It felt like a weapon, like a shield he had been missing all along. When he got back to the cabin, he sat at the old wooden table and spread everything out. He traced the lot lines on the map with his finger, realizing how much land was actually his. The dock, the path to the water, even the boat, they all belonged to him. And the HOA had been parading around, threatening him, when all along they were the ones standing on property they didn't own. That night he walked down to the dock and sat on the edge, his feet dangling over the water. The moon was high, casting silver light across the surface of the lake. He thought about the meeting, about the president threatening to tow his boat, and he almost laughed out loud. They wanted to tow his boat. It was his boat in the first place. The irony was almost too rich, but he didn't want to celebrate too soon. He knew people like the HOA board weren't going to admit defeat easily. They would fight, deny, and twist the truth until the very end. That was why he had to be ready, why he couldn't rush. So he made a plan. He wouldn't reveal everything right away. He would wait until they made their next move, until they tried to cross the line again. Then, in front of everyone, he would bring out the truth. The paperwork would speak louder than their arrogance ever could. He could already imagine the look on the president's face when the sheriff read the deed out loud, when the smug expressions melted away as they realized they had been the trespassers all along. For now, though, he stayed quiet, stacked the papers neatly, locked them in a fireproof box, and tucked it away safely. Then he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the dark water with a small, satisfied smile. The fight wasn't over, but the game had changed. He wasn't the one on the defensive anymore. The truth was on his side, and soon the entire lake community was going to see it. 2 weeks passed quietly after he gathered all the documents. Didn't hear anything from the HOA during that time, but deep inside he knew they weren't finished. People like them never backed off easily. They liked power too much, liked controlling people too much. He stayed patient, working on small repairs around the cabin, fishing when the weather was good, and keeping all the paperwork close at hand. He was waiting for their next move, and then one Friday evening he got his answer. He arrived at the cabin after work, and before he even reached the porch, he noticed something strange. The path to the dock looked different. His chest tightened. As he hurried down to the water, there it was. A heavy padlock had been slapped onto the gate leading to his dock. A bright orange notice flapped in the wind, nailed to one of the posts. Notice of eviction property in violation of HOA regulations. Access restricted. His hand shook with anger as he yanked the notice down. They had crossed the line this time. Blocking access to the dock wasn't just harassment. It was trespassing, plain and simple. This was his land, his dock, and they had no right to touch it. Without thinking twice, he pulled out his phone and called the sheriff's department. His voice was steady, though his blood was boiling. "I need an officer out here. My property has been padlocked by the HOA. I have my deed. They're trespassing." The dispatcher promised to send someone. He stayed by the dock, pacing back and forth, the notice crumpled in his hand. Within half an hour, a patrol car rolled up the dirt road. 2 deputies stepped out, one older with a calm face and one younger who looked eager to prove himself. He waved them over and pointed at the dock. "There, they put a lock on my dock and nailed up that notice. This is my property. I have the deed inside if you need to see it." Out. The older deputy frowned, looking at the lock and then at the orange paper. "OA, huh?" he muttered. "Seen them pull this kind of stunt before?" "Not on my land they don't," he snapped. "Come. Inside, I'll show you the deed." Inside the cabin, he spread the documents out on the table like he had practiced. The deputies leaned over, reading the descriptions, the survey maps, the signatures. The younger deputy looked up first. "This is clear as day. The dock is on your lot. The HOA doesn't own it." The older deputy nodded. "Yep, you're the legal owner here, which means this lock. It's trespassing." A surge of relief ran through him, mixed with triumph. Finally, someone with authority had said it out loud. They walked back outside, and as if on cue, headlights appeared down the road. A few cars pulled up, and out stepped the HOA president, the woman in the blazer, and a couple of their supporters. The president looked furious the moment he spotted the deputies. "What's going on here?" the president barked, marching toward the dock. "This man is in violation. We've posted notices." "That dock is community property," the older deputy held up a hand, his voice calm but firm. "Not according to county records. This man owns the entire lot, including this dock." "You don't have authority here." The president's face turned bright red. "That's impossible. Our bylaws, your bylaws don't apply to land you don't own," the deputy interrupted. "And right now, you're trespassing. I suggest you take that lock off before we start writing citations." The woman in the blazer stepped forward, her voice sharp. "This is a clerical mistake. The HOA has jurisdiction here. We'll clear it up later," deputy said, his patience thinning. "The documents are clear. You're in the wrong. Remove the lock." For a long moment, no one moved. The president's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. Finally, muttering curses under his breath, he waved one of his men over. The man pulled out a key and unlocked the padlock, yanking it off the gate. He watched the whole scene, with satisfaction burning inside him. The look on the president's face, part rage, part humiliation, was worth every sleepless night he had spent worrying. The older deputy turned back to him. "If they bother you again, call us right away. You've got every right to press charges. If they keep this up..." He nodded. "Thank you. Believe me, I'll call." The HOA group stood there awkwardly, shuffling their feet. The president glared at him one last time before stomping back to his car. The others followed, their earlier smugness gone. Their headlights cut through the night as they drove away, leaving behind only the sound of crickets and the soft lapping of water. Neighbors had gathered during the commotion, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. Whispers spread quickly. He overheard people asking what happened, and soon the truth was traveling down the road. The HOA had been caught trespassing. The sheriff had sided with him. The so-called leaders weren't as powerful as they pretended to be. He stood on the dock, finally free of the lock, watching the patrol car drive away. A sense of victory settled over him, though he knew this wasn't the end. People like the president didn't give up easily. But the balance had shifted. The neighbors had seen it with their own eyes. The sheriff had made it official. The HOA's power was cracking, and everyone knew it. That night, as he sat on the porch sipping a cup of coffee, he replayed the scene in his head. The president's red face, deputies standing firm, the lock being removed. It was exactly what he had hoped for, the turning point he had been waiting for. For the first time since the whole mess started, he felt at peace in his cabin again. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, calm and steady, as if it too had been waiting for this moment. He leaned back in his chair, letting the night air wash over him. The HOA had tried to scare him. They had tried to bully him. But tonight, they had been forced to back down. And deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning of their downfall. The weekend after the showdown with the sheriff, he drove back to his cabin with a different feeling in his chest. It was no longer dread or anger that weighed on him. It was confidence. He had the papers, he had the law, and now the whole neighborhood knew the truth. Still, he wanted to make everything official so there could never be another question about it. He called Daniels, his lawyer, and explained what had happened. Daniels laughed when he heard about the sheriff making the HOA unlock the dock. "They won't recover from that embarrassment," he said. "But let's make sure we finish this the right way." Together, they filed the proper documents at the county office, attaching surveys and deed records. Daniels also drafted formal notices addressed to the HOA board. The notices were blunt. The dock and the boat were not theirs. They had no authority over his land, and they were forbidden from setting foot on his property again. If they did, they would face trespassing charges. When he mailed the notices, he felt a deep satisfaction. It was not anger anymore. It was justice. For weeks they had threatened him with eviction and fines, had tried to make him feel powerless. Now, with a few pages of paperwork, he had turned the tables. The response came quickly. The HOA president showed up at his cabin one afternoon, but this time he wasn't smirking. He stood on the edge of the property, careful not to step past the line, and called out, "Can we talk?" He walked down the path slowly, arms crossed. "Talk about what?" The president shifted uncomfortably. "Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. The HOA, well, we were under the impression that land was community property, but obviously there's been some clarification." "Clarification?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You mean you tried to bully me off my own land?" The president's face tightened. "We'd like to work out some kind of arrangement. Maybe we could rent space on the dock for the community? Or keep using the boat under some agreement. We could make it worth your while." He almost laughed. "You want to rent space on my dock? You want to pay me to use my boat?" The president swallowed hard, but nodded. The answer came without hesitation. "No. You locked my dock. You tried to tow my boat. You called me a squatter on land I've owned for years. You don't get to work something out now. You stay off my property." End of story. The president's face flushed red, but he had no power left. He muttered something under his breath, turned on his heel, and walked away. News spread quickly around the lake. Neighbors whispered about how the president had been forced to back down, how the HOA wasn't as untouchable as they thought. People started digging into their own paperwork, questioning the fees and fines they had been paying for years. Meetings grew tense. Some members openly challenged the board, demanding explanations. The iron grip the HOA had held on the community began to crack. Meanwhile, he enjoyed his cabin like never before. Sitting on the porch with his coffee, watching the sun set over the water, he felt a calm satisfaction. He had faced them, and he had won. The dock was his, the boat was his, The land was his. And now everyone knew it. A week later, Daniels called with more news. "It looks like the HOA is falling apart," he said. "Several members resigned after all this came out. They're facing questions about how they've been running things. You may have done more than defend your property. You might have freed the whole neighborhood." The thought made him smile. He hadn't planned to be some kind of hero. All he wanted was to protect his cabin. But in standing up for himself, he had given others the courage to do the same. That weekend, as he sat on his porch, a couple of neighbors stopped by. Joe from across the road brought him a six-pack of beer. Another neighbor, a young couple who had just bought a small place nearby, thanked him for standing up to the HOA. "We were scared to say anything," they admitted. "But after what you did, we realized we don't have to be." He shook his head modestly. "I didn't do it for anyone else. I just did it because it was right, but I'm glad it helped." The lake was quiet that evening, the water calm as glass. He walked down to the dock and sat on the edge, watching the reflection of the moon ripple across the surface. Behind him, the cabin stood sturdy, the same way it had for years, touched by the HOA's threats. He thought about the fight, about the letters, the meetings, the sheriff's flashing lights, the red face of the president. And then he thought about the simple truth that had saved him. A deed, a piece of paper that carried the weight of law. That truth had been on his side all along. He realized then that revenge hadn't come from shouting or fighting. It had come from patience, from staying calm, and letting the truth speak for itself. The HOA had tried to scare him, but in the end, they had only destroyed themselves. He leaned back on his hands, breathing in the cool night air. The lake, the dock, the boat, all of it was his, and no one could take it away. The sound of crickets filled the night, and for the first time in a long time, he felt completely at peace. He smiled to himself, knowing the battle was over. Justice had been served, and he could finally enjoy his cabin the way it was meant to. Be enjoyed with quiet mornings, golden sunsets, and the steady knowledge that no one could ever threaten it again.